A spoiled young woman demands the seat of a poor elderly stranger on a bus. She regrets it after hearing his words. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment below where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into another emotional story that's sure to touch your heart. Ashley stepped onto the bus with quick strides, her high heels clicking against the metallic floor as she glanced around. The stifling heat and the smell of a long, busy day lingered in the air. She was exhausted. After hours at the office and a tense argument with her boss, all she wanted was a seat and maybe a few moments of peace. Her eyes scanned the bus interior. Every seat was taken, and the aisle was crowded with people gripping the poles and handles for balance. Frustration bubbled up inside her like a flame growing stronger. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself, huffing. Her furrowed brow made her irritation clear, and she pulled her purse closer, trying to avoid anyone brushing against her. Her gaze landed on one of the priority seats, where an elderly black man, simply dressed and holding a cane by his side, was sitting. He stared straight ahead, calm, seemingly unfazed by the chaos around him. Ashley pressed her lips together, indignation welling up inside her. "Is this serious?" she thought, staring intently at the man. She decided she couldn't tolerate this discomfort while he sat there. Approaching him, she crossed her arms and took a deep breath before speaking. "Excuse me," she said, her voice filled with impatience. "Don't you think you should give up this seat?" The man, Mr. James, slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. His gaze was serene but weary, like someone who carried years of stories and experiences. His face lit up with a gentle smile before he responded. "Good evening, miss. Any particular reason I should give up the seat?" he asked calmly, without any hint of hostility. Ashley couldn't hold back her irritation. "It's obvious. Look around. There are people standing. I had an exhausting day at work, I'm dead tired, and you're sitting there comfortably." Mr. James tilted his head slightly, as if considering the situation. Then, with patience, he replied, "I understand you had a difficult day, but just like you, I'm also tired. It's already late, and my legs aren't as strong as they used to be." Ashley frowned, surprised by his response. She hadn't expected resistance. "But this is a priority seat. I could easily sit there. I don't see any reason why you should keep sitting." Mr. James gripped his cane, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Priority seats are for those who need them most, miss. It's not just about who wants it or asks first." She crossed her arms, huffing again. "This is ridiculous. It's not like you're sick or anything. Just because you're old doesn't mean you need this seat more than I do." A faint shadow of fatigue crossed Mr. James's face, but he remained composed. "I understand your frustration. Life can be tough, and sometimes we feel entitled to demand something to ease our momentary discomfort. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the struggles of others." Ashley wasn't used to being challenged. Her arrogance made her feel in control, and his polite resistance only irritated her more. "Do you think you know me? Do you know what I'm going through? Maybe if you did, you'd understand that I deserve this more than you do." Mr. James sighed deeply, glancing at the people around them, who were avoiding the argument and pretending not to hear. He shook his head gently before responding. "Miss, I don't know what you're going through in your life, and I never intended to judge. But that's exactly why I'm staying here. Because, even though I'm exhausted, I don't think it's right to judge what someone else needs or deserves. And today, this seat is helping me endure the day I've had." Ashley was speechless for a moment. Something about his tone, the serenity, perhaps, made her hesitate. But her pride was strong. She rolled her eyes and, with one last attempt to impose her will, said, "This is ridiculous. If you're not going to give up the seat, then maybe you shouldn't even be here. There are younger and faster people who need this space." Mr. James remained silent for a moment, looking at her directly. There was no anger in his eyes, just a quiet firmness that seemed to disarm any argument. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we need to learn to carry our own weight, even when we're tired. It's a hard lesson, but a valuable one. He paused, leaning slightly on his cane. I hope that one day, you'll see it differently. Ashley huffed again but didn't have an immediate response. Something about those words echoed in her mind, but she refused to acknowledge it. Frustrated, she turned to face the aisle, gripping one of the safety handles tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. James adjusted his posture in the seat and looked away, staring ahead as if nothing had happened. Ashley clutched the bus handle tightly, her face flushed with frustration. She felt Mr. James's gaze like an uncomfortable reminder that her demand had been ignored. The day's exhaustion and irritation spilled over into words, and she turned back to him, raising her voice without caring about the intensity. This is ridiculous. I already told you I'm tired, I worked all day, and here you are acting like you own this seat. Don't you think young people like me, with real responsibilities, deserve a bit more consideration? Her voice echoed through the bus, drawing the attention of more passengers. Mr. James raised his eyes once more, maintaining his composure. He gripped his cane firmly but didn't respond immediately, letting the silence speak for him. His calm demeanor only fueled Ashley's anger. Are you just going to sit there and do nothing? Not even consider that other people might need this seat more than you? She pressed, shaking her head in disbelief. I don't understand how someone can be so selfish. Her harsh words landed like stones in the air. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable with the scene. Others watched hesitantly, as if debating whether to intervene. A woman seated a few rows away cleared her throat, seeming like she wanted to speak but quickly changed her mind. Finally, a young man standing in the aisle decided to step in. Hey, I think this has gone far enough, he said cautiously. Everyone here is tired, miss. Maybe it's better to just let it go. Ashley spun around abruptly, her glare as sharp as a knife. Let it go? Easy for you to say when you're not the one exhausted, hanging onto a bar with your arms aching. I have more important things to do than stand here waiting for justice. The young man raised his hands, signaling he didn't want further conflict, and retreated to the back of the bus, mumbling something Ashley chose to ignore. An elderly woman seated nearby adjusted her glasses and shook her head disapprovingly. My dear, maybe you should show a little more respect, she said gently but firmly. This gentleman is clearly tired as well. Don't you think you're being a bit excessive? Ashley let out a dry laugh, almost incredulous. Excessive? I'm young, I have responsibilities, and you expect me to stand here sacrificing myself while he sits there like his day was more important than mine? Spare me the moral lecture. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one seemed willing to continue the argument. Silence began to settle once again, tense and heavy, like a storm waiting to erupt. Miss, Mr. James finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, I'm not here to argue over who had the hardest day. I'm here because, like you, I'm just trying to get home after a long day. I don't believe anyone's responsibilities or exhaustion give them the right to humiliate another person. Humiliate? Ashley exclaimed, taking a step forward. I'm just speaking the truth. People like you think that just because you're older, the whole world revolves around you. I work hard, carry more weight than you can imagine, and all I'm asking for is a seat to rest. People like me, Mr. James repeated, a reflective tone in his voice. He raised his eyebrows slightly but remained calm. And what exactly do you mean by that? Ashley hesitated for a moment, realizing the weight of her own words, but her arrogance stopped her from backing down. You know exactly what I mean. Sitting here like it's some privilege, while others need the rest much more than you. Younger people like me, who have bills to pay and real responsibilities. You probably just sat around all day. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hum of the bus's engine seemed muted compared to the tension in the air. Some passengers stared at Ashley with disapproval, while others looked too uncomfortable to intervene. A woman carrying shopping bags muttered to the person next to her, "How sad, treating an elderly man like that." Mr. James kept his gaze fixed on Ashley, but now there was something different in his expression. It wasn't anger or offense. It was something deeper, as if he could see through her mask of arrogance and glimpse something else. Still, his words came out calm and steady. "Miss, we all face challenges, and we all carry burdens that aren't always visible. I don't believe yelling or humiliating someone is the solution to any of those problems." "Oh, of course," Ashley replied with sarcasm, crossing her arms. "Now I'm the villain, is that it? It's easy to say those things when you're sitting comfortably." Once again, silence filled the bus. By now, every pair of eyes was on them. A man sitting at the backside, visibly uncomfortable, while another passenger clutched her bag tightly against her chest, staring at Ashley in disbelief. Mr. James adjusted his position on the seat, holding his cane with both hands. He didn't respond immediately, letting his previous words linger in the air. Ashley, however, couldn't handle the silence. She felt she needed a response, some validation to justify her attitude. But none of the passengers seemed willing to agree with her. The tension on the bus became almost unbearable, as if everyone was waiting for the next move in a game no one wanted to keep playing. Ashley took a deep breath, her face still flushed, but something in her eyes suggested she was starting to realize the disconnect between her words and the reactions around her. The bus continued its route with the usual bumps and jolts, but the atmosphere inside was far from normal. Ashley's words, sharp as blades, lingered in the air, leaving an obvious discomfort on the passengers' faces. Some avoided eye contact, while others watched the scene with expressions of disapproval. No one seemed eager to get involved, until a voice emerged from the middle of the bus. "You've said enough," declared a man standing near the rear door. He had a serious expression and a firm posture, his voice filled with conviction. Dressed in a simple uniform, likely returning from work, his presence stood out like a beacon in the rising tension. "You're being disrespectful, and you don't even realize how wrong you are." Ashley turned quickly, glaring at the man as if he had just insulted her personally. "Disrespectful? I'm just saying what anyone with common sense would think. I don't see why he has more right to this seat than I do." The man crossed his arms, standing his ground. "Common sense? Do you think yelling and publicly humiliating someone is common sense? Everyone here is tired, but no one else is treating others like this." "Oh, of course," Ashley retorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now I'm the problem because I had the courage to say what no one else will? I'm tired of people who think they're entitled to everything just because they're older or, I don't know, think they deserve something special." The stares in the bus grew even more intense, and it was clear that her words were crossing invisible lines. The man sighed and shook his head. "Do you even realize what you're doing? You're treating this man like he's nothing. Like only your exhaustion matters. And honestly, what did he do to deserve this? Sit down after a hard day, like the rest of us?" Ashley huffed and rolled her eyes, but her growing irritation made her words even sharper. "You're acting like he's some kind of saint just because he's sitting there holding a cane. Big deal. Maybe he doesn't even need it that much. After all, plenty of people fake things like that to get away with it." A heavy silence fell over the bus. Even the passengers who had tried to feign indifference were now staring at her in shock. It was as if she had crossed a line no one expected her to. "Enough," said a female voice from the back. It was the same elderly woman who had tried to intervene earlier. "That's enough. Your words are shameful, young lady. Respect is the foundation of everything, and it seems you've never learned that." Ashley turned, her expression a mix of surprise and indignation. "Shameful? Oh, spare me. Why is everyone here acting like I'm the only one in the wrong? I have the right to speak my mind. I'm not going to stay quiet just because you all want to protect him like he's made of glass." Mr. James, who had remained silent until now, lifted his eyes to her. His face, previously calm, now showed a hint of sadness. He took a deep breath, leaning on his cane as he responded, his voice low but full of meaning. "Miss," he began, with an almost otherworldly calmness, "you can say whatever you want. We live in a world where words can be used to build or destroy. And right now, you've chosen to use yours to hurt. Hurt? Ashley interrupted, laughing with disdain. Oh, come on. It's not like words are a real problem. If that offends you, the problem isn't me. It's you. Mr. James lowered his gaze, as if searching for strength within himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades of untold experiences and pain. You're right about one thing. Words shouldn't define us. But sometimes they reveal a lot about who we are. And what you said, miss, wasn't just disrespectful. It was something deeper. Ashley crossed her arms, defiant. Oh, and what exactly did I say that was so terrible? The silence that followed was broken by another passenger, a younger woman seated near Mr. James. She leaned forward and stared at Ashley. You know exactly what you said. And if you don't, maybe you should think about what just came out of your mouth before saying anything else. Ashley hesitated for a moment, feeling the accusing stares around her. But her indignation and pride stopped her from backing down. I only said what everyone else is thinking but doesn't have the guts to say. You're all judging me like you're better than me. What hypocrisy! Mr. James, however, didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window for a moment, as if trying to find comfort in the passing nightscape. When he spoke again, his voice was marked by a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Miss, he said calmly, people can think many things, but how they choose to act defines who they truly are. And today, you chose to act in a way that I sincerely hope never reflects who you really are. Those words plunged the entire bus into tense silence. The passengers' indignation was evident, but there was also something else. A quiet respect for Mr. James, who, despite everything, had maintained his dignity. Ashley, on the other hand, began to realize she was alone in her stance. The isolation unsettled her, but she didn't know how to back down without appearing weak. Her breathing was heavy, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse tightly. The man who had intervened earlier shook his head again and spoke once more. The issue here isn't who's right or wrong about the seat. It's how you chose to handle it. We've all seen it. You can keep shouting, but no one here is going to agree with you. Ashley felt the weight of his words and the silence around her. The passengers' reactions left no doubt. She had lost. But instead of admitting it, she pressed her lips together and turned toward the aisle without another word. The atmosphere on the bus remained heavy, but now there was something different. As Mr. James adjusted himself in his seat, some passengers began exchanging knowing glances, as if they understood that, in some way, the truth had been spoken, even if the discomfort lingered. The bus continued its usual route, but the mood was far from routine. The tense silence and averted gazes among the passengers turned the space into a charged environment. However, no one expected what would happen next. The sharp sound of brakes echoed through the vehicle as the driver, a middle-aged man with a calm but determined demeanor, pulled the bus over to the side of the road. All the passengers were lightly jolted forward by the sudden stop. Murmurs of confusion began to spread, and Ashley, still standing near Mr. James, looked around with an irritated expression. "What's happening now?" she muttered loudly, crossing her arms. The driver stood up from his seat, removed his cap, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at the passengers, his eyes firm and serious. His presence, usually quiet and unnoticed, now commanded the room. "Good evening, everyone," the driver began, his voice projecting across the bus. "I apologize for this unexpected stop, but I think we need to address something before we continue on our route." The murmurs quieted, and all eyes turned to him. The driver cast a direct look at Ashley and then at Mr. James, who remained seated, his cane gripped tightly in his hands. "I've been driving this bus for almost 20 years, the driver continued. "I've seen all kinds of people come and go, each with their own stories, their struggles, their joys. And honestly, it's rare for me to get involved in anything that happens between passengers. But today, I can't stay silent." The silence in the bus became almost tangible. Some passengers adjusted in their seats, while others gripped the safety bars tightly, curious and tense about what was unfolding. "Mr. James," the driver said, turning to the elderly man, "I've known you for a long time. I know you don't like attention, but today, with your permission, I'd like to share a bit of your story." Mr. James raised his eyes to the driver, surprised. For a moment he seemed about to protest, but then he simply nodded, inclining his head slightly. The driver took a deep breath before continuing. "For those who don't know, this gentleman here is not just another passenger. He is one of the most respected figures in our community. A veteran who served this country with honor, dedicating years of his life so that all of us could have the freedom we enjoy today." Some passengers murmured in surprise, while others looked at Mr. James with a newfound sense of respect. The elderly man, however, remained calm, though his fingers tightened slightly around his cane. "But that's not all," the driver continued. "After serving this country, he returned to this community. And instead of resting or seeking recognition, he devoted his time to helping the people here. He organized literacy programs for young people, helped build the neighborhood's public library, and mentored many who now have careers and families thanks to his guidance." The murmurs grew louder. Some passengers began whispering to each other, while others stared at Mr. James with growing admiration. Ashley, on the other hand, stayed silent, her expression shifting from indignation to something closer to confusion and discomfort. "I, myself," the driver said, pointing to himself, "am an example of the impact he's had. When I lost my father at a young age, it was Mr. James who helped me find my way. He encouraged me to keep studying, and when I thought about giving up, it was his words that kept me going. So, seeing Mr. James treated this way here today, I just can't ignore it." The driver's voice wavered slightly with emotion, but he quickly regained his composure. The silence inside the bus grew even deeper, almost reverent. "I know we all have hard days," he continued, glancing briefly at Ashley, who avoided his gaze. "We all get tired, frustrated, and angry. But that doesn't give us the right to take it out on others. Especially on someone who has done so much for all of us." The driver paused, letting his words resonate throughout the space. Then he looked back at Mr. James and gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging something greater than himself. "I didn't have to share any of this," he concluded, adjusting his cap. "But I thought everyone here deserved to know who this man is. He would never ask for respect, but he deserves it. And then some." The passengers began reacting in different ways. Some nodded silently in agreement, while others murmured words of respect and admiration. A woman in the back of the bus even started clapping, and soon others joined in, creating an unexpected moment of unity. Ashley remained motionless, silenced by a wave of shame louder than any verbal reproach. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. It was clear that the driver's words, combined with the weight of the passengers' reactions, had broken something within her, but she said nothing. Mr. James, who had stayed silent until then, finally raised his head. He looked at the driver and smiled warmly but humbly. "Thank you, Bill," he said, his calm voice filling the space. "You didn't have to do that. But I appreciate your words." The driver nodded and returned to his seat, adjusting the bus controls. Before restarting the engine, he turned to address the passengers one last time. "I hope this gave us all something to think about," he said in a lighter tone. "Now, let's get moving." With the rumble of the engine, the bus resumed its route. But something had shifted. The tense atmosphere had been replaced with one of reflection and respect. Many passengers glanced at Mr. James with new eyes, while others remained silent, processing what they had just heard. And amidst it all, Ashley, who had begun the day so sure of herself, now seemed small, lost in thought, unsure of how to react to the reality that had just been revealed. The bus continued in an almost reverent silence after the driver's speech. The passengers seemed to be absorbing Mr. James's story, processing every detail about the man who, until now, had been just another face among them. Mr. James, however, remained seated in his usual position, his expression serene, as if the moment were just another in the many he had lived. But the silence was broken by a woman's voice, trembling but determined. An elderly lady, seated a few rows away, held her purse on her lap and adjusted her glasses as she gathered the courage to speak. "May I say something?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it immediately drew everyone's attention. The passengers turned to her, curious about what she might say next. She looked directly at Mr. James and gave a small, warm smile before beginning. Bill shared an important part of Mr. James's story, but there's something more that I think everyone should know. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I've known him for many years, and he's not just a veteran or a mentor. He's a symbol of perseverance, someone who has faced challenges that few of us could ever endure." Mr. James sighed and gave a small smile, as if he wanted to ask her to stop, but the woman continued, undeterred. "I grew up in this neighborhood," she began, looking around as if sharing a precious secret. "And I remember well how hard things were for Black people back then. Discrimination was something you faced every single day, without exception. And Mr. James," she paused, adjusting her glasses again. "He was one of the few who dared to challenge it." The passengers listened in complete silence, captivated by the intensity of the unfolding story. Even Ashley, who had maintained a defensive posture since the beginning of the confrontation, seemed unsettled. Though she tried to keep her head held high, her hands gripped the bus handle tightly, betraying the discomfort creeping into her. "When he was young," the elderly woman continued, "he dreamed of becoming a teacher. He wanted to teach, to change the way young people saw the world. But at that time, that wasn't an easy path for a Black man. He faced closed doors, insults, even threats, but he never gave up." She paused, as if recalling something particularly difficult. "I remember when he started teaching in a small room in the basement of a church. He had almost nothing, just a few old books and the desire to teach. Young people went there because they knew he cared. He didn't see color, he didn't see class. He only saw the potential in each of them." Some passengers nodded in quiet approval, and the woman continued, now with an emotional glint in her eyes. "Over time, his work gained attention. He earned a scholarship to study at a university. But even there, he faced discrimination. He had to prove time and again that he deserved to be there. And he did. He graduated with honors and returned to the neighborhood, where he began working as a teacher at a local school." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, with some glancing at Mr. James with renewed admiration. Ashley, on the other hand, remained still, but her expression had changed. Her face was paler, and her eyes, once filled with indignation, now seemed to search for something to focus on, avoiding Mr. James's gaze. "But it wasn't easy for him," the woman continued. "Even as a teacher, he faced resistance. Some people didn't want a Black man teaching their children. He heard terrible things, was treated with disrespect countless times. But do you know what he did?" She looked directly at Ashley, who quickly turned her gaze away. "He kept going. He ought anyway, because he knew he was making a difference. He knew that if he gave up, the young people who depended on him might lose hope." Mr. James lowered his head slightly, as if reflecting on it all. His eyes were distant, but there was a faint moisture in them, as though the memories had touched him more deeply than he cared to admit. "Today," the woman concluded, "many of the people he helped are out there, with careers, families, and lives they might never have achieved without him. And do you know what's most remarkable? He never asked for recognition. He never expected applause. He did it all because he believed in what he was doing." The bus sank into another profound silence, but this time it carried a different weight. It was a weight of admiration, respect, and, for some, shame. Ashley felt it like a punch to the stomach. Her hands trembled slightly, but she tried to maintain her composure. Internally, however, a battle raged. Each word from the elderly woman seemed to dismantle her self-confidence and force her to confront her own arrogance. "That's what you need to know about Mr. James," the woman said, her voice now soft, almost a whisper. "He's not just a man sitting on a bus. He's a living inspiration. And I hope we can all learn something from him." The passengers began murmuring again, this time with tones of approval. Some even nodded toward Mr. James in a silent gesture of respect. He, however, simply smiled humbly and said softly, "Thank you, Mary. Your words are far too kind." Ashley felt her cheeks burn. She knew she was wrong, that she had judged someone without knowing anything about him. But how could she admit it? Her pride still held her captive, though the shame had already rooted itself deeply in her heart. As the bus continued its route, the young woman avoided the gazes around her. Inside, she began to reflect on the words she had heard, but she still wrestled with the need to acknowledge her fault. The weight of the moment felt heavier than she was ready to bear. The bus rolled on through the busy city streets, but the dense silence lingered. Only the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the wheels broke the charged atmosphere that had taken over the vehicle. Ashley, now seated in an empty spot at the back, clutched her bag tightly to her lap. Though she tried to maintain an indifferent expression, her discomfort was evident. She felt the disapproving stares around her like needles piercing her skin. She glanced briefly at Mr. James, who remained in his seat, calm but distant. The stories told by the driver and the elderly woman still echoed in her mind. Even so, her pride prevented her from admitting any wrongdoing, and she began justifying her actions under her breath, almost as if trying to convince herself. "I was just tired," she murmured, fiddling with the clasps on her bag. "There's nothing wrong with wanting a seat. Everyone does that." Her voice wavered, and she realized that even as she spoke the words, she couldn't fully believe them. Nearby, two passengers started a quiet conversation, but their voices were still audible in the silence. Ashley couldn't help but overhear. "Do you remember when he helped that family after the fire?" asked a young woman with curly hair, sitting next to an older man. "Of course I do," the man replied, crossing his arms. "They lost everything. He showed up with food, clothes, even found them a temporary place to stay. He did it all without expecting anything in return." The young woman nodded, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "My mom always talks about him. She says that when she was a kid, he used to give free lessons at the church. She'd go there after school because he'd help with homework and tell stories to inspire us." Ashley turned away, trying to block out the conversation, but the words seemed to infiltrate her thoughts, persistent and unrelenting. Further up, another passenger, a middle-aged man wearing a worn hat, turned to the woman beside him. "Did you know he was also the one behind the fundraiser that renovated the community center?" "I didn't know that," the woman replied, surprised. "But it doesn't surprise me. He's always been involved in everything around here. If it weren't for him, my nephew probably would have dropped out of school. It was Mr. James who convinced him to stay." "That's true," added the man. "He didn't just help the boy with his classes, he also got him a scholarship. Now my nephew is in college, all thanks to him." Ashley clutched her bag tighter against herself. Each story seemed to add more weight to the guilt pressing on her chest. She tried to distract herself by looking out the window, but even the passing scenery couldn't push away the thoughts piling up in her mind. Meanwhile, two elderly women sitting near Mr. James began speaking in affectionate tones, as if reminiscing about an old friend. "Do you remember when James organized that fundraiser in the square?" one of them asked. "He managed to bring musicians, comedians, even food trucks to help pay for that girl's leukemia treatment." The other woman smiled and nodded. "How could I forget? He rallied everyone together. And it wasn't just about raising money. He also visited the girl in the hospital every week. He didn't rest until he was sure she was getting the care she needed." Mr. James, sitting between them, shook his head and gave a modest smile. "I didn't do it alone," he said, finally breaking his silence. "Everything that happened was because the community came together. I was just one piece of the puzzle." "That's so typical of him," murmured the woman beside him, chuckling softly. "Always so humble." Ashley closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sounds around her, but the stories kept coming from different parts of the bus. Each voice seemed to add another piece to the picture of who Mr. James really was, not just a veteran or a teacher, but someone who had dedicated his entire life to the well-being of others. The stories were like small blows to her armor of arrogance. She tried clinging to the justification that she had simply been standing up for her rights, but it sounded increasingly hollow. Her exhaustion, so real when she boarded the bus, now felt small and insignificant compared to what she was hearing. As she wrestled with her thoughts, more passengers joined the conversation. A young woman with headphones hanging around her neck commented enthusiastically, "Mr. James also helped with the recycling program, remember? My mom always says it was because of him that the city started taking it seriously." "That's true," another person chimed in. "And he never stopped. He's still out there, even now when he could be resting. He's an inspiration." Ashley could no longer pretend she wasn't listening. The words were everywhere, surrounding her like a rising tide. She glanced at Mr. James again, trying to find something in him that might justify her earlier behavior. But all she saw was a simple man, sitting with dignity and calm, despite the discomfort she had caused. Her heart felt heavy. For the first time in a long while, Ashley felt ashamed, not just for what she had said, but for what it revealed about herself. For years, she had prided herself on her independence, on her ability to stand her ground in any situation. But now, she realized that this attitude often blinded her to others, to their stories, to their struggles. The conversations continued, but Ashley could barely hear them now. She was lost in her own thoughts, grappling with the discomfort of recognizing that she had been unfair, arrogant, and disrespectful. The weight of the stares around her paled in comparison to the weight of what she was beginning to feel inside. The bus carried on its route, but for Ashley, the journey seemed only to be starting. The bus continued along the illuminated streets, its movements accompanied by the soft glow of streetlights. The tension that had been almost palpable earlier had given way to a reflective silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of passengers still discussing Mr. James's stories. Despite the calmer atmosphere, Ashley remained restless. Sitting in the back, her mind raced with the events that had just unfolded. She felt uncomfortable but tried to maintain an indifferent posture, crossing her arms and staring out the window. The image of Mr. James, serene and unshaken, seemed etched into her mind, a memory she couldn't push away. As the bus approached a stop near the center of the neighborhood, Mr. James began to move slowly. He gripped his cane firmly and, with a faint groan that hinted at the weariness in his joints, rose from his seat. The gesture caught everyone's attention. It was the moment when he would leave the bus. Watching from afar, Ashley felt a momentary sense of relief. Perhaps his departure would lessen the stares still directed at her. She didn't expect any more confrontations, any further embarrassment. But Mr. James surprised everyone. Instead of walking directly to the door, he turned slowly toward the back of the bus, where Ashley was seated. His gentle eyes met hers, and he spoke with a calm voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss," he began, a slight smile on his lips, "I'm getting off here. The seat is all yours now." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Ashley's eyes widened, shocked by the unexpected offer. Some people exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Mr. James's gesture. It didn't seem merely polite. It carried a symbolic weight that everyone could feel. Ashley stammered, trying to find the right words. That's not necessary," she managed to say, but her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. Mr. James, however, didn't waver. "I insist," he said, still smiling. "You've had a tough day, and I think a little rest will do you good." His words hung in the air, making it clear that he wasn't just offering the seat, he was doing so with purpose. There was no sarcasm, only genuine generosity, something that felt out of place in the context of everything that had happened. Ashley felt the weight of the gazes around her. Refusing publicly could be seen as arrogance, but accepting meant implicitly admitting her fault. She looked down at her hands, still clutching her bag tightly, then back at Mr. James. Embarrassment was written all over her face. I really don't need it, she insisted, but her voice wavered. You shouldn't, but... Mr. James interrupted her gently, this isn't about need. It's simply a gesture. And sometimes, accepting a gesture can be just as important as offering one. The entire bus seemed frozen in time, waiting for Ashley's response. She looked around and saw the expectant faces of the passengers. Some were visibly moved, while others appeared curious about how she would react. The discomfort inside her grew like a snowball, but more than that, she felt something new, a profound sense of humility. Finally, after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, Ashley took a deep breath and hesitantly stood from her seat at the back of the bus. "All right," she said softly, almost in a whisper, slowly making her way to the seat Mr. James had vacated. When she reached the seat, she paused, looking at him once more. There was something different in her eyes now, a mixture of shame, gratitude, and respect that she couldn't put into words. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice low but sincere. Mr. James simply nodded, saying nothing more. He gripped his cane with both hands and began walking slowly toward the door. Some passengers murmured words of approval, and others nodded at him as he passed. "Good night, Mr. James," the driver said as he carefully stepped off the bus. "Good night, Bill," he replied with a smile. As the bus doors closed behind him and the vehicle started moving again, the atmosphere inside felt completely different. Some people still glanced at Ashley, but now their looks carried less reproach and more curiosity, perhaps even a touch of compassion. Ashley sat in the seat Mr. James had offered her, but she couldn't relax. She felt small, as though every word and action from that night still echoed around her. As the bus jostled along the streets, she couldn't shake the image of Mr. James's gesture. He had offered something she had selfishly demanded, but he had done so with dignity and kindness, despite everything she had said to him. She looked down at her hands and realized they were trembling slightly. Something inside her was beginning to shift. A small but significant spark of understanding had been lit. For the first time in a long while, she felt the urge to do something she rarely did: apologize. But the words remained stuck in her throat. As the bus continued its route, she knew Mr. James's gesture would stay with her, a lesson she couldn't ignore. Ashley hesitated for a moment, staring at the empty seat Mr. James had just vacated. She knew all eyes were on her, waiting to see how she would respond to his unexpected gesture. Embarrassment burned her cheeks, but there was something else, something that began to chip away at the armor of arrogance she had built around herself. Finally, she took a small step forward, drawing in a deep breath. Every movement felt like a monumental effort. When she reached the seat, she stopped, unsure. Slowly, she turned and met Mr. James's gaze. For the first time, she looked at him directly, not with curiosity or scrutiny, but with genuine intent to understand the man who had been at the center of so much conflict that night. Mr. James held his cane in one hand and looked at her with a calm but firm expression. There was a gentle glow in his eyes, a mix of understanding and patience, as if he could see beyond her actions and into something she didn't yet recognize about herself. When he spoke, his voice was low but powerful enough to break through the silence of the bus. "Youth," he said with a faint smile, "is more than just age. It's about learning to respect those who came before you." His words hung in the air, touching not only Ashley but also the other passengers who listened in silence. They carried the weight of years of wisdom and experience, a reminder that life was about more than individual struggles or fleeting exhaustion. It was about connection, respect, and growth. Ashley felt a lump rise in her throat. Mr. James's words resonated deeply, challenging her convictions and fragile justifications. Something in his tone, his demeanor, disarmed any argument she might have had. He wasn't trying to reprimand or humiliate her. He was simply speaking the truth with a simplicity that made it all the more powerful. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her mind was in chaos. What could she say to him after everything she had done and said? How could she justify her behavior to someone who had shown such dignity and generosity? The silence, once her ally in feigned indifference, now left her feeling even more exposed. Ashley finally sat in the seat offered by Mr. James. She felt the weight of the action as though the very seat carried the symbolism of his gesture. Her fingers gripped the straps of her bag, and she tried to look away, but it was impossible to ignore his presence. Mr. James still watched her, not with judgment, but with infinite patience. After a moment, he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging her decision and finding it satisfactory. Then he turned toward the bus door, ready to leave. As he descended the steps, the passengers remained silent. There were no applause or audible comments, but the atmosphere was reverent. His words still echoed in everyone's minds, leaving an impact that couldn't be ignored. Ashley felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, but her attention was fixed on Mr. James, who now walked slowly along the sidewalk with his cane. Even from behind, he seemed to exude dignity, as if carrying the weight of countless battles fought and won. His words continued to echo in her mind. Youth is more than just age. It's about learning to respect those who came before you. She repeated the phrase mentally, trying to understand why it affected her so deeply. It was as if he had seen something inside her, something she hadn't known existed. And by doing so, he had planted a seed of reflection that was just beginning to grow. Ashley remained silent for the rest of the ride. She had no words, neither to justify nor explain what she felt. All she knew was that something had changed. It wasn't just the discomfort of being confronted with her mistakes. It was something deeper, a sense that perhaps it was time to reevaluate how she saw the world and herself. As the bus continued on its route, Ashley glanced again at the seat where Mr. James had been sitting. Now empty, it seemed to hold an invisible presence, a reminder of what had happened. A reminder that the most important lessons often come from the most unexpected moments. She didn't know how or when, but she felt that Mr. James's words would stay with her for a long time. And although she wasn't ready to admit it out loud, something within her was beginning to shift. Ashley stepped off the bus that evening feeling strangely light yet weighed down by a heaviness she couldn't quite identify. The cool night breeze brushed against her face, but it did little to calm the whirlwind in her mind. Each step toward her apartment was burdened with reflections she couldn't ignore. Mr. James's words echoed like a mantra. Youth is more than just age. It's about learning to respect those who came before you. Each repetition seemed to peel back a layer of arrogance she had carried with her, exposing emotions she had long buried: shame, empathy, and a desire to be better. When she finally reached her apartment, she tossed her bag onto the couch and sank into a chair, exhausted. But it wasn't physical exhaustion, it was emotional. She replayed every moment on the bus in her mind, every word she had said to Mr. James, and every look of disapproval she had received from the other passengers. For the first time, she didn't try to justify her behavior. There was no excuse that could erase what she had done. The truth was simple: she had been wrong. In the days that followed, Ashley carried that feeling like a weight on her chest. At work, she often found herself distracted, completing tasks on autopilot. Her colleagues noticed her lack of focus, but no one said anything. She knew something needed to change, but she didn't know where to start. During this time, the stories she had heard on the bus kept replaying in her mind. The impact Mr. James had on the community, his patience, his dignity, it all made her question who she was and who she wanted to be. Had she become someone so self-centered that she couldn't see beyond herself? That question haunted her. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, fate, or perhaps something more, brought Mr. James back into her life. Ashley had decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear her mind and escape her restlessness. As she passed a bakery, the scent of fresh bread wafted out, and she decided to step inside for a moment. As soon as she entered, her eyes were drawn to a familiar figure at the counter. There he was, Mr. James, his cane resting beside him as he calmly selected a few loaves of bread. He wore a simple coat and seemed as serene as he had been that night on the bus. But seeing him there, so close, made Ashley's heart race. She froze in the doorway, hesitating. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave, to avoid the embarrassment. But another part of her knew this was the opportunity she had been waiting for, or dreading, since that night. Taking a deep breath, she took a few steps toward the counter. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she kept going, driven by something stronger than fear, the need to make things right. When she was close enough, Mr. James noticed her presence. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, Ashley froze, unable to say a word. But his gaze held no judgment. It was the same calm, patient look as before, as if he already knew why she was there. "Hello, miss," he said with a faint smile. His voice was gentle yet firm, just as she remembered. Ashley felt a lump form in her throat. Her mouth felt dry, but she knew she couldn't back out now. "Hi, Mr. James," she replied, her voice quieter than she had intended. "But I wanted to talk to you." He didn't say anything, only tilted his head slightly, encouraging her to continue. Ashley took another deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about that night on the bus." Her words came slowly, as though she were carefully weighing each one. "I want to apologize. Truly." Mr. James remained silent, watching her closely. Ashley felt the weight of his gaze but also found the courage to go on. "I was disrespectful, selfish, and prejudiced," she admitted, her voice beginning to tremble. "I didn't listen, didn't try to understand. I only thought about myself, and I was unfair to you." She looked down, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "I'm ashamed of what I did," she continued. "And after hearing everything about you, about how you've helped so many people, I realized how wrong I was. I wish I had realized it sooner." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Ashley kept her eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for Mr. James's response. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was as gentle as she remembered. "Thank you for your words," he said. "It's not easy to admit when we've made a mistake, especially when it confronts us so directly." Ashley slowly lifted her eyes, surprised by the understanding in his tone. "We all make mistakes, miss," he continued. "What matters is what we do afterward. And I can see that you're trying. That's already a big step." Ashley felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want to cry in front of everyone, but his words touched her deeply. "I hope I can do better moving forward," she said sincerely. "I want to be different." Mr. James smiled again, a smile that seemed to carry years of wisdom and compassion. "Change begins with small steps," he said. "And you've taken one today." They stood in silence for a moment, but it was a different kind of silence, less heavy, more comforting. For the first time in days, Ashley felt that maybe she could forgive herself and move forward. After paying for his bread, Mr. James picked up his cane and, before leaving, looked at her once more. "Remember, miss, respecting others isn't just for their benefit. It makes us better too." With those words, he left the bakery, leaving Ashley alone with her thoughts. But this time, she didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. She felt something new, hope. Ashley barely slept that night. After her brief but profound encounter with Mr. James at the bakery, it felt as though an invisible weight had begun to lift. But along with that newfound lightness came a sense of responsibility. She knew she needed to do more. Apologizing was a step, but it wasn't enough to fix what was broken inside her. In the days that followed, Ashley found herself lost in reflection. Mr. James's words about respect and youth echoed in her mind, and the stories she had heard on the bus returned as constant reminders of the impact he had on his community. For the first time in a long while, Ashley felt she needed to make a change, not just to make amends with him but to grow as a person. Later that week, she decided to visit the bakery again, hoping to find Mr. James. She wanted to thank him, but more than that, she wanted to learn more about his story. And perhaps, she thought, learn something that could guide her in her own transformation. On a quiet Saturday morning, She entered the bakery and spotted Mr. James toward the back of the shop, calmly selecting some items. He was alone, his cane resting against the counter and a cloth bag already filled beside him. Ashley took a deep breath and walked toward him. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't embarrassment that paralyzed her. It was a quiet determination. "Mr. James," she called, her voice steadier than she expected. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers again. A gentle smile appeared on his face. Hello, miss. It's good to see you again. I wanted to thank you," she said, taking a small step closer. "For everything you said the last time we met. And for your patience with me. I know it wasn't easy." Mr. James tilted his head slightly, a gesture that seemed to encourage her to continue. "I want to apologize again," Ashley said, her voice thick with emotion. "This time, not just for the words I said on the bus, but for my entire behavior. I was selfish, prejudiced, and disrespectful. I know that can't be erased with a simple apology, but I want to learn. I want to be different." Mr. James listened silently, his expression full of empathy and understanding. When she finished, he nodded, setting his cane aside to adjust the bag he was holding. "Ashley," he said, using her name for the first time, "what you're doing now shows you're already on the right path. Admitting a mistake is never easy, but it's the first step toward growth. And sometimes, those moments shape us in ways we can't yet imagine." A tear rolled down Ashley's cheek, but she didn't try to hide it. "Thank you for giving me this chance," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I would have done if you had just ignored me." Mr. James smiled. "I'm not the kind of person to ignore others. You know, when I was young, I faced situations very similar to what happened on the bus. It wasn't easy growing up in a world where the color of my skin was seen as a reason to be treated as inferior. But I learned that if I let others' hatred consume me, it would give them even more power over my life." He paused, watching Ashley's expression as she listened intently, absorbing every word. "That's why I chose a different path," he continued. "I chose to teach, to help, to build bridges where there were once only walls. And I didn't do it just for others. I did it for myself too. To prove to myself that I could make a difference, even in a world full of challenges." Ashley nodded, feeling deeply moved. "I never thought about it that way. How did you manage to keep that calmness, that kindness, after everything you've been through?" Mr. James let out a low chuckle. "It wasn't easy, Ashley. And it wasn't always there. But I realized that hate and resentment only lead to one place: loneliness. And that was something I wasn't willing to accept." His words struck a chord deep within Ashley's heart. For the first time, she clearly saw the impact of her actions, not just on others, but on herself. She saw how her arrogance and selfishness had distanced her from others and from the person she wanted to be. "I want to do something," she said suddenly, her voice resolute. "I want to give back somehow. Help others like you do. Maybe then I can start making a difference, like you." Mr. James smiled again, clearly pleased with her response. "I think you already know where to start. Sometimes, the biggest changes begin with the smallest gestures." Their conversation was interrupted by the clerk, who handed Mr. James his purchases. He thanked the clerk and, with some effort, began adjusting the bag in his free hand. Ashley watched, but this time, she didn't hesitate. "Let me help you with that," she said, stepping forward and gently taking the bag. Mr. James looked at her, surprised, but didn't refuse. "Thank you, Ashley," he said, a grateful glint in his eyes. "You know, this is a good start." They walked out of the bakery together, strolling slowly down the sidewalk. The day was sunny, and Ashley felt something new within her, a sense of purpose. As she helped Mr. James carry his groceries, she felt as though she was also carrying a piece of his legacy, a legacy of empathy, respect, and resilience. And though there was still much to learn and change, Ashley knew that this simple gesture symbolized something greater. It was the beginning of a new journey, a transformation that, for the first time, she truly wanted. The prejudice that had once blinded her was beginning to fade, replaced by something far more powerful, the desire to be better. And with every step beside Mr. James, she knew she was on the right path. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content. There are more amazing stories waiting for you. Click here and keep watching.